What if the most important question facing two farmers on opposite sides of the Atlantic is not how much they can grow, but who controls the market waiting at the end of the harvest? Consider an American farmer surrounded by machinery, paved highways, grain elevators, storage facilities, and one of the most productive agricultural systems ever built. He can choose his seed, operate sophisticated equipment, manage his land, and produce enormous quantities of food. Yet there is one thing he cannot command from his tractor. He cannot decide how much a major foreign buyer will purchase, what tariffs governments will impose, or how geopolitical competition will affect the price of his crop. Now travel to Burkina Faso. Here the farmer begins from a very different position. His challenge is not simply finding a distant export customer. It may be getting his harvest from the field to a processor, from the processor to a warehouse, and from that warehouse to a reliable market. That is why Ibrahim Traoré's deployment of 776 vehicles and heavy construction machines deserves attention. These machines do not grow rice or maize, but graders, bulldozers, excavators, tankers, and road building equipment can help create something agriculture cannot function without connection. And that raises a much larger African question. What happens if a road in Burkina Faso allows a farmer to reach a processor, a national food reserve, or eventually more buyers across Mali and Niger? The issue is not whether Burkina Faso can compete with American agriculture. It cannot match America's scale today, and that is not the meaningful comparison. The real issue is dependency. If you want evidence-based analysis of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, the Sahel, and Africa's changing economic future, subscribe to the channel because we are going to follow this story beyond the machinery. We will examine whether roads can create markets, whether Burkina Faso is building an agricultural chain rather than isolated projects, whether deeper AES cooperation could expand African trade, and where this strategy could fail. Because sovereignty is not measured by how impressive the machines look on delivery day. It is measured by what can move behind them. Now consider what those different forms of dependency look like from the farm itself. An American farmer begins with advantages that will be extraordinary in much of the world. He may have powerful machinery, reliable electricity, paved roads, commercial storage, crop insurance, sophisticated financing, and access to an enormous domestic market. The United States remains an agricultural powerhouse. Its problem is not an inability to produce. The vulnerability appears later in the chain. For 2026, the United States Department of Agriculture forecasts net farm income at roughly $153.4 billion. That remains above the inflation-adjusted average of the previous 20 years. Yet, after accounting for inflation, net farm income is expected to decline by about 2.6%. Direct government farm payments are projected to reach roughly $44.3 billion. Those figures do not describe agricultural collapse. They describe something more useful for understanding Africa. Production capacity does not eliminate market risk. An American farmer can fill a grain bin and still worry about commodity prices, tariffs, foreign competition, or whether a major overseas customer will continue buying. Now, consider a farmer in Burkina Faso. His vulnerability can begin much earlier. Agriculture provides livelihoods for a large majority of the population, while many small farmers remain dependent on rainfall and face difficulties accessing quality inputs, modern techniques, transportation, processing, and dependable markets. So these two farmers should never be presented as economic equals. Their countries possess vastly different levels of wealth, infrastructure, technology, and agricultural capacity. But they can still teach us the same lesson. The American farmer may control almost everything until the crop reaches the market. The Burkinabe farmer may lose control at several points before his crop even gets there. One depends partly on decisions made in distant markets. The other may depend on rainfall, a passable road, an available truck, a functioning mill, and a buyer willing to reach his community. That is why the deeper question is not simply who produces more. It is how many links between the field and the final buyer remain outside the producer's control. And that is where Burkina Faso's road building strategy begins to matter. Now, the 776 machines come into focus. They should not be mistaken for 776 tractors handed directly to farmers, and they are not a military fleet. The equipment assigned to Faso Mêbo includes machinery intended for construction and public works, including graders, bulldozers, excavators, compactors, tankers, cranes, and road building equipment. None of those machines can produce a single bag of rice, but they can attack one of the barriers standing between production and a functioning market. Burkina Faso has a large road infrastructure challenge. World Bank assessments have reported that only about 26% of the country's classified road network, roughly 15,272 kilometers, is paved. Beyond that network are tens of thousands of kilometers of predominantly rural roads. During difficult weather conditions, poor roads can make transportation slower, more expensive, and less predictable. For a farmer, that is not an abstract infrastructure problem. Imagine a rice mill that can economically collect harvest from only 20 villages, because reaching communities farther away takes too long and costs too much. If better roads allow that same processor to reach 80 villages, something important has changed. The government has built a road, but economically it may also have expanded the market. More farmers can reach the processor. The processor can obtain more raw material. Trucks can make more reliable journeys. Warehouses can receive larger volumes. Buyers can reach communities that were previously too expensive to serve. That is the strategic potential behind Faso Mêbo. But potential is the important word. A bulldozer photographed at a handover ceremony proves almost nothing about future farm income. The real evidence will come later. Did transportation costs fall? Did travel times improve? Did processors begin buying from more communities? Were roads maintained after the first rainy seasons? If the answer to those questions is no, then 776 machines remain expensive equipment. If the answer is yes, Burkina Faso will have accomplished something more consequential than purchasing machinery. It will have reduced some of the distance between African production and African demand. And roads are only one link. To understand Traoré's larger experiment, we now have to look at what is happening on the farm, inside the processing plant, and inside the food warehouse. Roads become far more important when they connect to a larger agricultural system. And Burkina Faso is showing signs of trying to build several parts of that system at the same time. Consider Riche. During the 2025 to 2026 agricultural campaign, Burkina Faso's Presidential Initiative for Agricultural Production and Food Self-Sufficiency reported producing about 14,800 tons of rice. In April 2026, the initiative transferred 2,500 tons to the National Food Security Stock Agency. The program also works with 17 rice mills and provides producers with support that includes seeds, fertilizer, and plowing services. Processing facilities have also received equipment intended to improve the quality of locally processed rice. Now place that beside another investment. In 2025, the government delivered more than 104 billion CFA francs in agricultural and livestock equipment and inputs equivalent to roughly $188 million. That package included tractors, pumps, farming machinery, seeds, fertilizer, and processing equipment. This creates an important distinction. One group of machines goes into the field to increase production. Another group, including the Faso Mêbo equipment, goes onto the roads that can carry that production outward. But neither group is sufficient alone. Between the field and the consumer, Burkina Faso still needs processors, warehouses, financing, reliable transportation, businesses willing to buy, and consumers able to pay. That broader chain is also visible in a $215.9 million agricultural transformation project approved by the World Bank in 2026. Its focus includes rice, and maize productivity, processing, access to finance, technology, and better access to markets. This does not prove that every initiative belongs to one perfectly coordinated master plan. Different programs have different institutions, financing sources, and objectives, but taken together, they reveal the economic challenge Burkina Faso is attempting to solve. Growing more food is only the beginning. The crop must be processed. The processed food must be stored. The stored food must move. And somewhere at the end of that chain, someone must be willing and able to buy it. That is when agricultural production becomes an agricultural market. And they are already encouraging economic numbers. But those numbers also reveal why Burkina Faso is still very far from declaring victory. Economic growth is where the story becomes more encouraging and more complicated at the same time. According to the World Bank, Burkina Faso's economy grew by an estimated 5.3% in 2025, compared with 4.8% in 2024. Real economic output per person also increased, while inflation fell sharply. Strong agricultural performance, favorable weather, and government programs supporting agriculture, livestock, and fisheries were among the factors behind that improvement. Those numbers matter. They suggest that Burkina Faso is not simply announcing projects while the economy stands still. Agriculture has contributed to measurable economic progress. But now comes the number that prevents this story from becoming a celebration. Millions of Burkinabe people still face serious food insecurity. The World Food Programme has reported roughly 2.3 million people facing acute hunger, while conflict, displacement, extreme weather, and disrupted livelihoods continue to place enormous pressure on vulnerable communities. Think about the contradiction. A country can produce more food while families remain hungry. Gross domestic product can rise while a village remains isolated. Inflation can fall while a farmer still struggles to reach a profitable buyer. And a new road can create economic opportunity without guaranteeing that the poorest household will benefit from it. This is why the real test of Ibrahim Traoré's strategy cannot be economic growth alone. Suppose a new road cuts the journey between a farming community and a rice mill. That is progress. But what happens next matters more. Does transportation become cheaper? Does the mill offer farmers a better price? Do more traders enter the area? Does household income rise? Can families afford more food? Those are much harder questions than counting machines. Security presents another obstacle. Infrastructure cannot create a normal market where farmers, truck drivers, merchants, and technicians cannot move safely. Nor can Burkina Faso assume that favorable rainfall will continue every year. So, the 5.3% growth figure should be treated as evidence of momentum, not evidence of victory. The most important economic number for Uganda may eventually be much smaller and more personal. After the harvest has been sold, transportation has been paid, and the family has bought what it needs, how much money remains in the farmer's pocket? If that number begins rising across Burkina Faso, then national growth will finally be reaching the field. Now the question becomes larger than Burkina Faso. If roads, processing plants, warehouses, and agricultural production begin working together inside one country, could the same logic eventually connect Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger? That possibility brings the Alliance of Sahel states into the story. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger do not yet operate as a fully integrated agricultural market. It would be misleading to suggest that a farmer in Burkina Faso can automatically sell across the entire alliance without logistical, regulatory, financial, or security obstacles. But the three countries are beginning to build institutions that could support deeper economic cooperation. One important example is the AES Confederation Bank for Investment and Development, launched by Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdurrahmane Chiani. The institution began with capital of 500 billion CFA francs, approximately $900 million. Its stated priorities include roads, agriculture, food security, energy, regional connectivity, and private enterprise. Now follow one bag of rice. Imagine it is grown in Burkina Faso using improved agricultural equipment. A better rural road allows a truck to collect it. The rice reaches a local mill, is processed, and enters a warehouse. Some remains inside Burkina Faso. But if regional infrastructure and trade rules improve, another portion could eventually find buyers in Mali or Niger. That is what a practical African market could look like. Not speeches about unity, but goods actually moving. Not isolation from Europe, America, or Asia, but more options inside Africa. For landlocked countries, this distinction is crucial. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will continue needing access to coastal trade corridors and international partners. Economic sovereignty cannot mean cutting themselves off from the outside world. It can mean becoming less vulnerable because the first available buyer is no longer always thousands of miles away. If AES cooperation can reduce barriers between producers, processors, investors, and consumers, a farmer gains something more valuable than political symbolism. He gains another choice. And in economics, additional choices can create bargaining power. That is why the emerging AES experiment deserves attention. The real question is not whether three governments can announce African unity. It is whether they can turn geographic neighbors into functioning economic partners. Ibrahim Traoré's role in this story is important, but it needs to be measured carefully. It would be easy to present him as the man personally building a new African market. That would exaggerate what one leader can accomplish. Markets depend on farmers, workers, businesses, consumers, infrastructure, security, finance, and institutions. What Traoré can influence is the direction of the state. His government has repeatedly connected food self-sufficiency, agricultural mechanization, local processing, road construction, and greater national control over development. Faso Mêbo fits into that broader direction because it attempts to strengthen Burkina Faso's capacity to build infrastructure with equipment and workers operating inside the country. Traoré has also emphasized the idea that Burkinabe people must take greater responsibility for building their own prosperity. That message helps explain his political appeal. Sovereignty becomes easier to understand when people can see it represented by a tractor working a field, a bulldozer opening a road, rice entering a local mill, or food moving into a national reserve. But visible assets can also become dangerous political symbols if they are confused with results. A machine delivered today tells us almost nothing about whether that machine will still be operating 3 years from now. A newly opened road tells us little about whether maintenance will be funded after several rainy seasons. And a government program that increases production has not completed its mission if farmers cannot sell profitably. That is why Traoré should ultimately be judged not by ceremony speeches or even the number 776. Ask instead how many machines remain operational, how many useful roads are completed, do transportation costs fall, does local processing expand, do farmers keep more income after harvest, does food insecurity decline? His regional influence should face the same test. Working with Assimi Goïta and Abdurrahmane Chiani to create new AES institutions may provide tools for deeper cooperation. But institutions matter only when they produce measurable economic value. Traoré may be helping create the conditions for greater African economic control. Whether those conditions become a functioning market will be decided by results. Western criticism of Ibrahim Traoré deserves attention, but it must be described accurately. There is no solid evidence that the United States, France, or the European Union opposes Burkina Faso simply because Traoré deployed 776 construction machines or wants farmers to produce more food. Western concerns are much broader. Relations with France have deteriorated dramatically. The dispute involves diplomacy, security cooperation, political direction, and Burkina Faso's effort to distance itself from its former colonial power. The European Union has also expressed concerns about constitutional government and the political transition, while Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have left the economic community of West African states. Some of those concerns cannot simply be dismissed as hostility toward African sovereignty. Traoré came to power through a military coup. Political power has become increasingly concentrated, and the transition to elected civilian government has been extended. That creates a legitimate question. If the state controls more resources and directs more economic projects, what institutions will ensure accountability, transparency, and efficient spending? International financial institutions offer another useful perspective. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have recognized Burkina Faso's recent economic progress, while also warning about security risks, governance, investment efficiency, job quality, and the need for a stronger private sector. That criticism matters because government machinery alone cannot create a market. The state can build a road, but businesses must use it. A government can support rice production, but processors must remain commercially viable. Warehouses need customers, and farmers need prices that reward their work. Yet, the Western argument also has limits. Political institutions alone do not build rural roads, process rice, irrigate fields, or guarantee that farmers can reach buyers. For ordinary Africans, political accountability and productive capacity should not be treated as competing choices. A stronger model would demand both. Burkina Faso should be able to increase control over its economic future, while citizens retain the ability to judge whether that power is being used effectively. The real debate, therefore, is not Africa against the West. It is whether greater sovereignty can produce greater prosperity without sacrificing accountability along the way. The lesson for other African countries is not that every government should copy Burkina Faso or that every nation needs its own Ibrahim Traoré. The more useful lesson is to study the structure. Producing more food is not enough if farmers cannot reach buyers. Building roads is not enough if those roads do not connect productive regions with processors, warehouses, and consumers. Regional unity means little if goods remain expensive or difficult to move across borders. That is why African economic sovereignty should be measured by choices. Can a farmer sell locally, nationally, and regionally? Can a processor obtain raw materials from neighboring countries? Can African capital finance infrastructure that increases African production? But self-reliance must not become self-isolation. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are landlocked. They still need coastal corridors, international investment, technology, and trade with countries beyond the AES. Africa does not become stronger by replacing dependence on one foreign partner with dependence on another. The stronger strategy is diversification. Work with outside partners where cooperation creates value. Build domestic capacity where dependence creates vulnerability. Expand African trade wherever neighboring economies can complement one another, and demand accountability throughout the process. If governments gain greater control over resources, citizens should demand greater transparency over how those resources are used. For other African nations, therefore, the question is not whether to follow Traoré. It is whether they can build systems in which African land, labor, infrastructure, capital, and markets create more value for Africans before that value leaves the continent. Return to the two farmers. In the United States, a farmer can stand beside sophisticated machinery, connected to paved roads, storage facilities, processors, and one of the most powerful agricultural systems on earth. Yet even he may look toward Washington, Beijing, commodity markets, and tariff negotiations and wonder what will happen to the value of his harvest. In Burkina Faso, the farmer begins from a different place. His question may be whether the road works, whether a truck can reach his community, whether a mill can process his crop, and whether another buyer can be found. That is why the real test of Ibrahim Traoré begins after the ceremony. Over the next 1 to 3 years, watch the numbers that are harder to celebrate on television. How many of those 776 machines remain operational? How many useful kilometers of road are completed and maintained? Does the cost of moving rice and maize decline? Does local processing expand? Do farmers keep more money after selling their harvest? Does trade between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger increase? And most importantly, does food insecurity decline? If those indicators improve, the machines may eventually be remembered as one part of a larger attempt to convert sovereignty into productive capacity. If they do not, 776 impressive machines could become 776 expensive symbols. That distinction matters far beyond Burkina Faso. Across African news, discussion about the African Union, Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, Abdourahmane Tiani, France, Mali, Niger, West Africa, and the wider Sahel often become arguments about personalities and geopolitics. But beneath those arguments sits a more practical question. How much of the journey from African soil to African income can Africans control? The lesson is not that every country needs to copy Burkina Faso. It is that sovereignty becomes stronger when farmers have more buyers, businesses have better infrastructure, countries have more trading partners, and governments are accountable for the resources they control. Africa does not need to choose between trading with the world and building markets at home. It can do both from a stronger position. So if Burkina Faso proves that better infrastructure can connect farms, processors, warehouses, and regional consumers, should other African countries study this model? And what should they refuse to copy? Share your judgment in the comments. And subscribe if you want to follow what happens after the ceremonies. Because history will not judge this experiment by the number of bulldozers Traoré delivered. It will judge what Africans were eventually able to build, move, sell, and control with them. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.